Welcome, Guardians. I'm Cadet Col Horvath. In today's brief, we will cover the third chapter of the United States Space Force's Military Doctrine, Military Space Power. As an overview, we will be covering the nature of war, the value of military space power, and then we'll cover the full spectrum of military space power. So we'll get into all of these components and leave you with a little bit more information about Chapter 3. So Dr. Everett Carl Dolman once said, "The purpose of military power is to be prepared and when called upon by the legitimate governing authority to maximize violence within its constraints and limitations placed upon it." So war's enduring nature. The first component we're going to discuss is the nature of war. We must first understand and appreciate the value of the high ground. Listen to this quote from the Capstone document. "The value of the high ground is one of the oldest and most enduring tenets of warfare. Holding the high ground offers an elevated and unobscured field of view over the battlefield, providing early warning of enemy activity and protecting fielded forces from a surprise attack. From history, the high ground has been advantageous for many reasons. It gives an elevated view of the battlefield, provides early warning of attack, gives a distinct energy advantage, and forces the enemy to expand energy to obtain the high ground, thus diluting their combat power. The space domain encompasses all of these attributes. Thus, it is the high ground of modern warfare. As a result, military space power is linked to war. But what is war? The Capstone document states that war is socially sanctioned violence to achieve a political purpose. As Karl von Clausewitz said, "War is a continuation of politics by other means." This is as true today as it was 200 years ago when he said it. In every domain in which humans have inhabited, there has been war, or at least the potential for war. Space is no different. The U.S. views, in accordance with international treaties and agreements, that the use of force is for peaceful purposes. However, it must be accepted that in reality, it must be defended from those who would seek to undermine our goals in this domain. Clausewitz also said that war is a clash of opposing wills. Thus, war is a dynamic competition. The human element in war must not be underappreciated. Humans, not weapons, fight wars after all. This human element injects uncertainty, surprise, emotion, adaptation, disorder, and cunning into the conduct of war. Warfare is defined as the methods by which war is waged. War exists on a spectrum, from declared hostilities between nation-states to violence between non-state actors. There is a mixture of cooperation, competition below armed conflict, and all-out conflict. Political goals, policy, and the law of armed conflict shape war's intensity. While the nature of war more or less stays the same, the character of war evolves through time. Breakthroughs in science, technology, and social system structures change the character of war. Science and technology, and using these to the pursuit of military advantage, shape how wars are fought. They shape warfare, but not war itself. For most of history, waging war meant engaging in direct physical violence. Obviously, that's not how war is necessarily done today. The same is true to some extent. However, technological advancements have made the historical aspect of war no longer universal. The 7 joint functions provide a systematic framework for understanding and waging war. This applies to the space domain as well. So first, we have command and control. Command and control is the exercise of commander's authority to direct forces in order to accomplish assigned missions. Next, you have information, which is concerned with the collection, dissemination, management, application of information to drive desired battlefield behaviors, disrupt and support friendly decision-making. Intelligence, this gives the commanders predictive understanding of the operational environment. We have movement and maneuver. This seeks to place forces in a position to advantage relative to the adversary. We have fire. This is concerned with the employment of weapons against targets in order to create effects. Next, we have sustainment, provide the logistical support military forces require to maintain our combat capabilities. And lastly, we have protection. Protection preserves the effectiveness and the survivability of mission-related military and non-military personnel, equipment, facilities, information, and so on. So going a little bit more into the modern character of war, we have global, fast, and it occurs on multiple domains. All warfare seeks to coerce an adversary. Formally speaking, coercion is the threat or application of force to cause an adversary to behave differently than it otherwise would. Coercion in warfare generally falls into 2 categories: deterrence, and compellence. Deterrence is preventing the action of an adversary because of their belief that your response outweighs their benefit from the action. For example, in the Cold War, the U.S. nuclear deterrence posture was set up so that the Soviets believed a U.S. response to their nuclear attack outweighed any benefit that the Soviet Union would gain from the attack. Extended deterrence and assurance basically has one actor embracing a partner's interests as their own. This signals to an adversary a determination to protect these interests. Think of U.S. support of Western European powers through NATO during the Cold War. Compellence attempts to forcibly change or shape adversary behavior, within legal limits of course, until compliance is reached. So how does the space domain fit into this? The space domain offers global perspective and global reach. This perspective is persistent, enduring, and responsive. This allows U.S. forces to deliver effects in the space domain and other domains globally, far removed from the U.S. homeland and with a minimal operational footprint. These capabilities are powerful deterrents to adversaries and affects the decision-making process. In war, victory is achieved when one side successfully imposes their political aims on a rival through coercion. This compels the other side to change their behavior and take an action that they would otherwise choose not to do. This can range from limited concessions to total surrender. There are two fundamental strategies for successfully employing military force as a political instrument: the strategy of incapitation and the strategy of erosion. The strategy of incapitation aims to render the enemy helpless to resist physically destroying their military capability, their ability to wage war. No, this does not demand total destruction of enemy military forces. It simply means the enemy is unable to resist by military means. The strategy of erosion aims to convince the enemy that adopting the change in political behavior involves less pain than continued resistance. A direct approach in war is rarely the best method of achieving victory. As the Capstone document states, predictable action is easily thwarted. Success in war often results when you find an indirect approach to force the enemy into a vulnerable position, strike them when and where they are vulnerable, and exploit their weakness. Realize that the enemy is trying to do the same to you. Thus, deception is a cornerstone to any war strategy. Again, how does the space domain fit into all of this? Well, we use military space power to deter behavior of adversaries, enable access to critical information, and inflict lethal and non-lethal violence. Keeping with the spirit that war is a clash of opposing wills, space warfare is also a clash of opposing wills. Thus, the true adversary in space warfare is not the spacecraft or some other object. The adversary is the mind of the enemy. Space warfare, like other forms of warfare, seeks to neutralize the capability and or the will of the adversary to resist. Now let's move on to the value of military space power. The formal definition of military space power is the ability to accomplish strategic and military objectives through the control and exploitation of the space domain. Military space forces practice military space power and provide a global perspective to the joint force. Military space forces are no different from any other warfighting force. They shape the security environment, deter aggression, and apply lethal and non-lethal force in, from, and to space. Military space power is unique, however. The one aspect of the space domain that makes it unique from all other domains is the status of global, persistent, and unrestricted legal overfights. The space domain combines the high altitude advantage point of space, the longevity of spacecraft, and an international legal consensus that recognizes the legality of overflight of any pinpoint on Earth. It boils down to denied area access. Through the space domain, we are able to provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, not to mention communications, to analyze adversary capabilities, COAs, and intent. This is important for space domain awareness and joint space commanders' decision-making processes. These capabilities help protect and defend the space domain, which in turn enables military forces to monitor and respond rapidly to any contingency around the world before establishing a large in-theater footprint. In addition, orbital flight enables an unmatched perspective of the space domain. Spacecraft can monitor other objects in space without atmospheric effects or the difficult nature of observing some orbital regimes from Earth. Also, some parts of the space domain, the lunar far side for example, can only be observed from space. Operating from space reduces the adversary's ability to surprise us. The key word here is reduces. Adversaries are capable of exploiting weak spots that we are not aware of. However, operating in the space domain helps protect from strategic, operational, and tactical surprise. Getting a little bit more into the full military spectrum, so it is true that space operations are multidimensional, and not just multidimensional in the sense of X, Y, and Z coordinates. The three formal dimensions for space operations are the physical, network, and cognitive dimensions. Each of these dimensions exerts simultaneous and interrelated influence on military space power. These dimensions are tightly coupled. Operators within the space domain must consider and affect all three in order to fully realize the benefits of military space power. For the space domain, just like all the other domains, it is critical to seize, exploit, defend, and protect valuable physical locations. It is useful to categorize the physical environment in order to compartmentalize operations in the domain. The space domain is thus divided into lines of communication and key orbital trajectories. Locks are routes connecting employed military forces with the base of operations and along which supplies and military forces move. Controlling locks enables timely repositioning, resupply, and reinforcement of military forces. Examples include spaceport launch trajectories, spacecraft recovery trajectories, minimum energy transfer paths from orbit to orbit, and transfer paths from the geocentric regime to cislunar regime and beyond. KOTs are orbits from which spacecraft can do useful things, such as support users, collect information, defend other assets, or engage the adversary. These parts of the space domain represent orbits for mission execution and power projection. They can be defined relative to the celestial body, relative to the advantageous energy state, or relative to other trajectories. Some examples include LEO, MEO, HEO, and GEO, as well as sun-synchronous orbits. Next is the network dimension. The network dimension is a physical and logical maneuver space and is not static. Examples of tactical maneuvers include monitoring and defending software, attacking adversary computer systems, duplicating networks, amplifying signals, shifting frequencies, and upgrading encryption, among others. The bottom line is that the links and nodes comprising the network dimension in the space domain are potential vulnerabilities, and physical and/or logical attacks against any segment of the network dimension may isolate the space system from its end user. Protecting all segments of the network dimension is part of mission assurance and requires a whole-of-government approach. Military space power shapes and manipulates the decision-making processes of adversaries, from how they process information, form perceptions, derive key judgments, and finally make decisions. All of these are aspects of the cognitive dimension. One of the many challenging dimensions of operating in the space domain is the lack of direct sensory input. This makes understanding physical operations difficult. Thus, affecting the cognitive dimension involves preserving the OODA loop, preserving the ability to observe and orient, and then to decide and act, all from a remote location. Acknowledging the cognitive dimension of the space domain emphasizes military space power as a coercive force. The cognitive dimension includes friendly actors, adversaries, and third parties operating at all levels of warfare. Space operations can deter adversary aggression based on the credible perception of an unacceptable counteraction, as well as assure allies and partners of a secure space domain. The key part is that in space warfare, most of the critical objectives are achieved in the cognitive dimension. Remember, the adversary in space warfare is not the spacecraft. It is the mind of the adversary. Deterrence, compellence, dissuasion, and assurance are manifested in the cognitive dimension. What value is neutralizing an enemy spacecraft if it fails to influence the perceptions or decisions of an enemy? Moving on to the electromagnetic spectrum, more specifically the transfer of energy using the EM spectrum, impacts all three dimensions of the space domain. Some examples include most spacecraft generate power from EM energy. Space power applications rely on remote operations. They make EM spectrum an important physical maneuver space. Wireless connectivity through EM spectrum enables rapid dissemination of data, impacts cognitive processes of users. So without these applications of the EM spectrum, modern space operations would not be possible. While the EM spectrum influences all three dimensions of space operation, it also is a potential conduit through which space missions can be disrupted or held at risk. Some examples include natural EM radiation can disrupt and damage spacecraft electronics and solar arrays. Weaponized directed energy can damage spacecraft and their payloads. EM energy can disrupt or deny EM spectrum links, isolating a spacecraft from its operators and users. False data or information can be injected into the networks, allowing adversaries to manipulate the cognitive processes of operators and decision makers. So due to these vulnerabilities, military space forces must defend the EM spectrum as a weaponized maneuver space. So in summary, we covered the nature of war, the value of military space power, and then covered the full spectrum of military space power. This concludes my briefing on Chapter 3 of the United States Space Force Military Doctrine. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We would be happy to reach back out to you and answer any of those questions that you may have. And we will see you in our next video. Thank you.